Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for how to use a cover crop species selector tool in on-farm applications. My name is Olivia Cayuet, and I'm a soil health program manager with the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture. I would like to introduce my colleagues, Erin Gundy and Anne-Marie Calabro with the Soil Health Institute. We three support the education component of Farmers for Soil Health. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide farmers, crop advisors, and conservation professionals and others interested with an overview of a cover crop species selector tool and insights on how this tool can be used across the Southern and Northeastern U.S. to improve cover crop establishment and better address on-farm goals such as reduced erosion, increased grazing, and weed suppression, to name a few. Today's webinar is supported by Farmers for Soil Health, or FSH. The initiative is one of many USDA-funded partnerships for climate-smart commodities projects. FSH is a collaborative initiative of commodity organizations, the United Soybean Board, the National Corn Growers Association, and the National Pork Board, with a goal to increase cover crop adoption. This specific project provides an incentive to farmers who are new to planting cover crops or who have been planting cover crops for many years. State-level commodity organizations working across 20 states, stretching from North Dakota to the East Coast, are involved with FSH to provide local technical assistance and outreach programming. FSH has also developed a website full of resources and information helpful to any of you working with farmers or if you're a farmer or landowner. You can learn more about FSH at farmersforsoilhealth.com. Enrollment for 2024 planted cover crops is open now through February 2025. Lastly, a few items about today's event. The presentation is being recorded and an email will be sent in the next week with a link to the webinar recording posted to the CRA YouTube channel along with the final feedback survey. We'll be working through the webinar in two sections relating to selecting cover crop species. We'll first start with Dr. Victoria Ackroyd, who will demo the Precision Sustainable Agriculture Cover Crop Species Selector tool. And then we'll hear from Dr. Stephen Mirsky. He'll discuss on-farm applications of this selector tool. Then at the end, we'll have time for general Q&A. As questions come up, please put them in the Q&A. You can upvote questions that you'd like to prioritize we cover live. If you run into any technical issues, please don't hesitate to directly chat myself, Erin, or Anne-Marie. We'll work to get these issues resolved. If you'd like captions on, you can enable those by clicking the three dots on your toolbar and navigating to captions. Be sure to hang on till the end for information related to the One Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit for attending this webinar. With that being said, I'm excited to introduce our guests, Dr. Victoria Ackroyd and Dr. Stephen Mirsky. I'll let Dr. Ackroyd introduce herself and take it away.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you for inviting us to speak today. We're thrilled to be here. Please, I'm just Victoria. I'm an assistant research scientist at the University of Maryland, and I am the program manager for the Northeast Cover Crop Council. I work extensively with Dr. Stephen Mirsky, who is a research ecologist at USDA ARS Beltsville Agricultural Research Center in Beltsville, Maryland. He co-leads the Precision Sustainable Agriculture Network, which has been developing these tools that we're going to talk about today and about which you're going to learn more shortly. So, with that said, our agenda for today, I do want to provide a little bit of the context for the tool that we're going to be demoing. And so we're going to go through some tool history. Cover crop selection decision points, I doubt will be new for any of you. We all use, similar frameworks in the end. We're all working in similar systems in the end. But I do want to explicitly point out where the tool is using your input to generate site-specific recommendations. Then I'll do the tool walkthrough itself. I'll flip to the internet and walk us through a case study. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mirsky for some discussion of on-farm applications for the tool. And he will also talk about some other tools in the PSA decision support suite. Say that 5 times fast. Before we cut to the questions and the CCA credit screen. So a little bit of history about the tool. The Northeast Cover Crop Council Cover Crop Species Selector tool actually started life as the Midwest Cover Crop Council Species Selector. They led the way back in about 2006 developing this species selector. They were publicly funded, and so they were very eager to share their work with anyone that was interested to develop the tool to be used in other regions as well. And so when I came into the Northeast, I came with this idea of regionalizing the Midwestern tool for use in the Northeast. At that time, the research network that would become known as Precision Sustainable Ag, you'll see PSA listed throughout this presentation, that's them, decided that the tool needed a pretty extensive update. And so we went on ahead and we switched over to using a program called Airtable for the back end, which was awesome because it made it easier for us to import data into the tool, meaning it can be updated, and we do update the data in the tool as necessary. And it also makes it easier to export data, which is important for our programmers. In terms of user ease of use, we did go on ahead and put together a new user interface. And, you know, 3 little words do not describe the process that's involved with that. Steve and I'll talk a little bit more later about user testing. But we completely redid the user interface. So if you go to the Midwesterners Cover Crop Council website, the tool that you see there uses the same data as is in the tool for the Midwest in our version of it, but the interfaces are completely different. The PSA network also expanded the site-specific data to include the Northeast, the South, and data verification for the West has been done, but it's not imported into the tool yet. As I mentioned, Midwestern data is in the tool. This tool does work for use in the Midwest. So basically, this is just speaking to our interest in providing the most site-specific recommendations that we reasonably can, because in spite of the fact that we all work in agriculture, we all plant, we all harvest, you know, every site has its difficulties, every farmer has goals that they want to meet. And so site specificity is one of the things that we've identified as being a need for recommendation generating tools. And then you can see the URL down there at the bottom, the website name. You're certainly welcome to, you know, copy paste or Google search it and play with it as I talk. But I do want to talk about some of the screening points that are in the tool. So it doesn't really matter which species selector tool you're in. At some point, that tool is going to ask what your goal is for the cover crops, what you need the cover crops to do for you. And I kind of divide goals into 2 rough categories. You know, I think about benefits in terms of adding things to the system. You're looking to add nitrogen maybe with legumes, or you're looking to get an added benefit by being able to use that cover crop for grazing or forage. And you can literally go to the goals page. It's one of the first ones we're going to hit and see all the goals we've got listed there. The other category that I think of when I think about what cover crops can do for me is more benefits in terms of remedies. Maybe you have a wet area. Maybe you have a problem with weeds. Maybe you're really struggling with wind erosion ahead of, you know, a slow growing cash crop. And so cover crops can do things like suppress the weeds or decrease erosion. And those sorts of goals are also obviously also listed on the goals page that we're going to see in a few minutes. You don't just think of goals, though, when you go to select your cover crop. You also think in practical terms about your site conditions. You've got to deal with the fact that temperature and moisture are going to dictate what you can pick for a cover crop. For example, you're not necessarily going to pick a warm season annual like sorghum Sudan grass if you're planting in the fall and you need it to overwinter. You need your cover crop type to match up with your planting season, along with matching up with your goals. I will say that the nature of the game is such that, you know, you can't always get into the field when you need to. You know, maybe it rains, maybe life happens. And so sometimes you find yourself needing to push your luck. And we do acknowledge that in the tool. For a lot of the regions in the tool, we do have an option that is called risk to establishment, where you'll look at, you'll see this later, you'll look at the possible planting window for the cover crop and you'll see a little yellow bar. And that means, as the key will tell you, that you can try to plant this during this period if you're desperate, but you're running the risk of it being a cool year, or usually it's a dry year is the problem. And so you've got a temperature or moisture risk to establishment potentially. But if you're in the position where something is better than nothing, these are your best choices. Along with the weather, you obviously have to deal with your soil. So our tool absolutely pulls from the Surgo database, which is the database that underlies NRCS's web soil survey. However, we recognize that that survey is not explicit down to the tiniest little, square foot in your field. And of course, a field can have multiple soil types in it. And so you absolutely can change the drainage in the tool. Whenever you see the option to potentially change preset input, feel free to do so, because this is part of better providing site-specific recommendations. And then finally, along with your goals and your basic site conditions, you've got system constraints to deal with. So the most obvious ones are the cash crop planting and harvest timing. There are ways to get around the fact that, you need, obviously, your main goal is to grow the cash crop, not the cover crop. For example, with cash crop planting, you may want to think in the cover crop that comes before it. If you're worried about getting in the field in time to plant that cash crop, you may want to plant a winter-killed species so that you simply don't have to worry about killing the cover crop in the spring. You have too wet of a spring, can't get in there to kill the cereal rye, and now it's taller than you are. But if you plant something like usually radish will winter kill where I am, then the weather does it for you. Likewise, maybe consider not killing the cover crop before planting the cash crop, and instead try planting green, where you plant the cash crop and then you kill the cover at the same time, or you even wait up to, I think it's usually a week, and then you kill the cover crop before the cash crop starts coming up. Now, in terms of the fact that that cash crop is in the field, obviously, until you harvest it, sometimes, depending on the weather, here in Maryland, Virginia, it can be November before you get some of these agronomic crops off the field. And so obviously most cover crops need to be planted before then in order to get a good start ahead of winter. You can think about getting around the fact that the cash crop is in the field by doing things like interseeding. There's been some good research on that, especially with corn. You can also think about aerial seeding. Interseeding I usually think of as with like a drop spreader or whatnot. But with the aerial seeding, they're even moving towards putting down seed with drones nowadays. They're getting very creative to find ways around some of these limitations. And then depending on your system, you may have special concerns. For example, if you do know that you want to graze that cover crop, you may want to be careful about not picking species that can be toxic to your critters. You may want to think about not picking species that could taint milk, like turnips. Apparently, cows will eat turnips, but if they eat too much of the turnips, the milk tastes funny. So in our decision tool, we do have comments and notes where when a problem is known, we mention it. You may have concerns about the cover crop interfering with cash crop production. For example, hairy vetch seed potentially contaminating wheat if it manages to flower and go to seed. And so you do have to work through those constraints as well. So with that, I'm going to do a tool walkthrough now. So I'm going to hit escape. And then our URL is right here, covercrop-selector.org. And I am going to pick Maryland because I like to plant on the front lawn of work. So every state in this tool is set up so that it pulls for its starting location, the state capital. I don't think they grow many cover crops in many state capitals, though. So we're going to pick work, and there's the bit that always makes me a little seasick. And then I'm going to zoom in And so there's our circle drive. And you don't have to, but I want to draw our field. I want to grow these on the front lawn. Okay, so we have put in our field location, and you notice that it's telling us we are in USDA hardiness zone 7. That's not something you need to know right off the tip of your tongue, but if you do feel the need to change it, you can change that. Sometimes people are dealing with microclimates, for example, where they might want to have something other than the presets, as I previously mentioned. So here is the site conditions page. This is one of the, other than location, one of the screening points in the tool that helps to generate the recommendations. So it's pulled from Surgo, from Web Soil Survey, that we've got a Downer Hamilton complex for the soil. Right now, the weather information is just there as a reminder for you, your first and last likely frost dates and how much rain you can expect. Drainage class can be changed, and drainage class is one of the things that we did data verification for, because, annual ryegrass will generally put up with a fair amount of wet. Something like, come to mind. There are other plants that won't put up with as much moisture, but do better in drought. Maybe alfalfa, for example. And so depending on your understanding of your soil, you can absolutely change that. I'm going to leave it at well drained though, because most cropping systems do have a fairly narrow range of soil drainages. Our cash crops are pretty similar overall. You're usually in the middle is the sweet spot. You don't want super wet ground and you don't want super dry ground. And then you can also put flooding frequency in here, and that can also affect your output. So I'll talk more about affecting output in a minute, because I don't want you to think you're just going to have species disappear completely on you. For goals, you can pick up to 3, which seems to be kind of a common number across species selectors. I like to put nitrogen fixation as 1, because that's going to pull out some legumes for me. And I actually am going to pick nitrogen scavenging as another, because that kind of is a contrasting goal, which is going to set us up for some interesting output in a minute. Forage harvest value, good grazing, some soil health property information, increase soil aggregation, penetrate plow pan, prevent fall or spring erosion. You've got both as options. And of course, if you're interested in some of those, I don't want to say edge case, but less commonly mentioned benefits like pollinator food, that's there too. And then I am going to go on ahead and pretend that we are growing corn so that this will bring up the correct planting window setup for me to show you some of the very neat features in this tool. So I'm going to say we planted April 15th, and I'm going to pretend that we're having a difficult year and we're going to harvest it at about November 1st. This is field corn. Okay, so here is our preliminary sort where our goals are nitrogen fixation and nitrogen scavenging. And I'm scrolling down because I want to get down to the point where things are grayed out. Okay. And you can see here, goal 1, I fixed fixation. And so as you would expect, things like radishes don't fix nitrogen. And so they're completely gray for this goal. And on the other hand, the legumes, which are good for fixing nitrogen, tend to have low values for nitrogen scavenging, as you would expect. But something like cereal rye is top of the list. My point with this page is that no matter what the ranking for the goal for the cover crop, you don't lose the species. Our goal is for this tool to be as much a learning tool as a recommendation generator. And so wherever possible, we have set this tool up so that you can kind of just learn by seeing what's still there and what's, instead of, hiding options that aren't relevant. Of course, it does give you more to scan through. So we have a couple of really contrasting potential options here. Nothing looks great for both goals, which is why I picked those 2 goals. And yet it's very common to be both worried or concerned about nitrogen scavenging and also interested in some nitrogen fixation. As you know, if you have too much biomass with a high amount of C, carbon, and not enough nitrogen, you can run into problems potentially with the nitrogen being tied up in the soil the following spring, which doesn't mean it's gone. Quite the contrary, it's still in your system, but it does mean that it's not available to a cash crop like corn that needs it in a, specific time pattern. And so by planting both, you can kind of balance the amount of nitrogen accumulated versus the amount of nitrogen released. So I'm going to go over to the filters on our left, where we have a lot of really detailed options that you can pick from to further screen down this fairly long list of options. You can look at how much of a risk these cover crops are for becoming weeds. Anytime you see a circled question mark, that means mouse over it and it'll give you the definition. And so, if I want something that is low risk for establishment, I want a 1, means rarely volunteers. There we go. And let's see what that does to our output. 1 was not enough. Sometimes that mouse over button can be a bit of a headache. There we go. Okay. I want anything that's rated just a 1. That's a very small list. You can see now how it's graying out as I'm drilling down to further screen out and develop more detailed recommendations. So let's see what I gain by adding a 2 to the list. And I think I'm gonna hit the feedback button after I get off this call and mention to our programmers that I struggled a little bit with these ratings buttons. We do have this feedback button up at the top. And by all means, if you ever run into something that causes you trouble in terms of the programming of the tool, let us know. If you run into a rating that you don't agree with, let us know. Typos happen in spite of our best efforts and intentions. If you run into something where you think, gosh, it would be nice if this tool had this functionality, let us know. Drop us a line. We have a feedback button and our inboxes are always open. Okay, so you can see here that by selecting 1 and 2, I've gained myself some more options. I'm actually going to clear those filters and further show you some of the other optional filters. We've got environmental tolerances. So if you've got, a site that is super low fertility, you may want to pick something that has a high tolerance for low fertility. And that's generally going to be grasses, according to this. No, I think I've got the scale backwards. Let me go to check that scale. 1 means it's not tolerant of poor fertility, and 5 means it has a high tolerance. Okay, and again, I'm going to clear the filters, and I'm going to go to the growth traits and show you some of what's under that. So if you're worried about, something getting off to a fast start in the early spring because you're going to have to get in there and kill it pretty quick to get your cash crop in, you might work with the early spring growth filter. Establishes quickly. Likewise, if you've got a short growing window. Speaking of which, if you want something that flat out can be put in and gotten out in 6 to 8 weeks, you can work with the growing window filter to drill down on which cover crops are best for that. Winter survival is often a crucial decision point for a lot of people, depending on whether or not they're prepared to handle terminating it in the spring. Soil conditions, mycorrhizae are of interest for some people who want that benefit from their cover crop. And then moving into planting and termination considerations, can you frost seed? Well, it turns out there's only 1 species on the list for Maryland here that can be frost seeded, that being red clover. And I know that because it's got this little snowflake icon by it. We've also got termination filters so that you can see which termination methods might work best for any given cover crop. So now that I've covered the cover crop filters, I do want to talk a little bit about this main window before I move over to my list, which is a feature where we can focus on a handful of species instead of the whole list. So I put in our cash crop window, and so you can see that here in pink. And then the teal is the reliable establishment period for the cover crop. And so unless there is teal showing outside of the pink, you are dealing with either picking a different species or else you're dealing with planting during the cover cash crop window, excuse me, and, interseeding, aerial seeding, something like that. I had mentioned earlier the temperature and moisture risk to establishment bar. That gold colored chunk there means that, for example, here, cereal rye is something that if you're not able to get in the field until mid-November, but still want to try something, you could try cereal rye. You could also try triticale. Annual ryegrass might be an option for attempting, and winter wheat. Those are some of our hardier options, and so it's not really surprising that those are the ones that are listed as having the option of, we don't want to encourage this, but if you need something, here's something to try. So with that said, I do want to close my legend box here, and I want to pick a few contrasting cover crops and show you my list. So for any crop that you click, it will bring up the information sheet that has all of the information in the tool in one place for that zone, in this case, because we're in the Northeast, listed here if you want to go through and look at this or print it out or whatnot. Separate from that, you can add up to 5 species to your list. I have a personal soft spots for cowpea, so I'm going to go with cowpea versus winter pea. There will be a good contrast, and cereal rye, and I want one of these summer warm season annual grasses. Let's see, I see pearl millet. Let's do pearl millet. Okay, so that has added 4 cover crops to my selected cover crop list. And so then I go up here to this button and I click on it to bring me here. So again, you can pull up the information sheet by seeing view crop details. You can also go to comparison view. It starts off with just the cover crop name, both the common and the scientific name, and your average goal rating. So remember, we had picked nitrogen fixation and nitrogen scavenging, and none of these have huge, the average, as you would expect, is in the middle because we picked things that have different strengths and different weaknesses. I want it to break out the 2 goals for me. Okay, so you can tell your grass right away from the nitrogen scavenging, even though pearl millet's not as good as cereal rye. And so I could continue going through and clicking, I'm interested in heat. I'm interested in drought. This is kind of a way also to get around dealing with the stars thing if keeping track of, high versus low and which does which mean is too much of a headache for you. We can pick maybe duration. They're all annuals. That's a boring point. Let's get that off the screen. Ease of establishment, winter survival. Okay. So I've pulled up a few traits to look at, comparing these 2 legumes, one summer and one winter, and 2 grasses, again, one cool season, one warm season. And this just makes it easy to see side by side what I'm looking at. So cereal rye, as we can see, is really great for nitrogen scavenging, which is one of our key goals. It's going to do reasonably well in the heat and the drought, has very good ease of establishment. I would expect it to overwinter. Over here, we've got winter pea, which is a bit more of a mixed bag. It's great for nitrogen fixation, as you would expect of a legume. Not great for scavenging, not great for heat. It's a cool season legume. Middle of the road for drought, ease of establishment. It has a big seed. And then seldom versus expected for winter survival. So the scale here is never, seldom, or expected. And it might at first seem contradictory to see both of those there until you realize that Different cultivars may have different levels of hardiness. And so we've got both of those listed. If you ever do run into a question like that, you can go into our About page up here, and we've got a list of frequently asked questions. Would not be surprised if you use that feature when you see, for example, annual ryegrass to figure out what we're actually talking about. It's surprising how common it is for common names to be problematic, even with very common cover crops. Radish, what am I talking about? You've got tillage radish, you've got oilseed radish, you've got groundhog radish, you've got a whole bunch of different brandings, and figuring out what you're actually talking about can be tricky. Go into the FAQ and you can see exactly what we're talking about for any given species where there might be concern about confusion. So just wrapping up, I do want to clear these variables. But before I do that, I do want to point out what I was talking about in terms of how you can use this view to come up with a complementary mix. Stephen later on will mention we have a seeding rate calculator and mix maker now that is online, but for a while this was the only tool that we could point to from the PSA network where you could maybe generate some of that information. And so if you're feeling creative, you can always go to this page and you can find, you want a cover crop that has great nitrogen scavenging and let's say never survives the winter. We're going to grow something, May to July. And then you want something at the same time that's going to be good for nitrogen fixation and nitrogen scavenging together. This would be a case where I would pick, pearl millet and cowpea together to grow in a mix because they complement each other. One's good with the nitrogen scavenging, the other's good with the nitrogen fixation. They're both very solid for drought and heat. They have the right kind of winter survival matching up. And so, if you are feeling creative, you can kind of generate mixes from this, though that is not what this specifically is meant to do. As I said, we do have a seeding rate calculator and mix maker now online. So I'm going to hit clear variables and I'm going to go back to get a recommendation, and that brings up my old screen, and so this is the view that we've been working at for this screen, but you can go to the crop list screen as well. Same information, same screening out process. You can still use filters. This just provides a little bit different of a view where the planting windows are minimized in favor of talking about some of the more key points, kind of like for my selected crop or my selected crops, the screen that we were just in with just the 4 cover crops. And again, you can look and compare and contrast here if you'd like. So with that, we are at 1:05 Eastern. I'm going to go on ahead back to my slideshow. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to talk about on-farm applications of the cover crop species selector tool. Stephen?
Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Great. Well, thanks for having me here, everybody. Appreciate being a part of this session. You did a fabulous job as always, Victoria. She's been really a strong advocate and support for communicating the tool around the country and in lots of different groups. So it's great to have her be part of this event and showcase the work that we've been doing on sort of nationalizing these tools. The question here is about on-farm applications. And I think as you can see from the introduction that Victoria did around the species selector tool, that it's really meant to be an early sort of gateway tool into cover cropping and understanding the complexity of management decisions that drives cover crop performance and how you might go about choosing and integrating cover crops into your system. But the communication on those tools for any one species does have a significant range in sort of performance criteria, and that's because it's meant to be a generalized tool that really speaks to a broad audience and gets folks sort of integrated in just the use of the cover crops. But it's really once you start cover cropping for many years that you start to develop advanced experience and knowledge on how to best manage cover crops. And then you're in a very different box. You want a more surgical decision-making tool that is being used to help guide your decision-making so that you're, fine-tuning your goals. And so for that, we're making a suite of additional tools to sort of leverage what we've done in the species selection tool and provide some more in-depth knowledge. Thank you, Victoria. Appreciate it. Here, the Precision Sustainable Ag Network, I co-lead with Chris Ruberg-Horton at North Carolina State University. We've been sort of this centralized technology team of full stack developers, data engineers, all working together to nationalize a suite of different decision tools in partnership with NRCS and the regional councils. NRCS has been a big supporter and promoter of our efforts, and thus has resulted in us really bringing together and aggregating these tools into national tools. So the species selector being the first tool is nationalized, but now we have a seeding rate calculator that is going live quickly. We've tested this now in 3 regions from the Midwest to the Northeast and the Southern. It has been completed, and that tool will go live shortly. We've been iteratively improving that tool through a process called user testing, which I will explain in a second. And then we have another tool that will give you even more of a surgical management of your cover crops around the nitrogen applications that you would be doing in concert with your cover crops. So whether it's that you have a very heavy cereal rye cover crop that might be immobilizing some of your nitrogen, to you have very low performing cover crops, to you have a very high performing legume in your cover crop fields, that's going to vary how much nitrogen you're getting from that cover crop. But we also know, with a lot of experience with cover crops, that cover crops vary spatially across a field considerably. You could have parts of a field that are producing anywhere from 500 pounds per acre all the way up to 4,000 or 5,000, and the species can vary considerably, even though you put the exact same amount of seed across that whole field for a set number of species. And that's because these plants respond to their environment. If you're in a high nitrogen environment, you're going to tend to select for a grass. If you're a low nitrogen environment, you're going to tend to select for a legume. And so we built the nitrogen calculator, which is decades of science that's developed a process-based model that really comprehensively estimates the nitrogen release and availability from cover crops. And now we're combining this nitrogen calculator that's like a whole field estimate on how to adjust your nitrogen based on your cover crop performance with sensing technology that we call Plant Map 3D, which will be going live on custom applicators equipment in the Mid-Atlantic region, for example, this coming year, that maps the species and the biomass and will allow growers to do variable rate nitrogen with their cover crops. So for us, it's more and more about how that merging of precision and sustainable to take cover crops into a precision framework. And that's why you'll see more and more of these technologies have sort of site specificity to them. And we've also developed a national tool called the Cover Crop Econ tool for economic analysis that allows you to provide a more in-depth review of the cost of cover cropping. All of these tools will be interoperable, which means they work well with each other. They're going to communicate with each other. That are going to, if you opt in, it could even retain your user experience and user history, so that you're not starting from scratch every time you engage these tools. And as I mentioned, there'll be a lot of crossing between these tools, particularly like the economics and seeding rates and nitrogen calculator. All of these tools will be served up, through Precision Sustainable Ag, regional councils, but then also you can go back to that user testing, Victoria. And then as well through NRCS. And the goal is that over the long run, NRCS will be maintaining and supporting these tools in the long term, but in the near future, the Precision Sustainable Ag will be maintaining these suite of cover crop tools until NRCS is ready to pick them up. This is just a highlight. We're really learning a lot from working with folks in the software and the hardware space around how to do, really sort of a professional level user testing pipelines. This is where we're putting our software in front of a wide audience of users, whether it's folks who have a high degree of experience with cover crops, very little experience, folks who are ag professionals and consultants. Those are, students, farmers, industry. We get all of those personas involved in user testing that might be as simple as just like thematic, just style issues on a cover crop page, all the way to functionality and how the tool functions. And so we do these extensive user testing pipelines to iterate so that we're developing a very robust professional grade tool that has had a lot of input from a wide range of users. But we also allow folks to continue to provide comments on these tools and give us feedback as they're live so that we can continue to iterate and improve the quality of these tools. I think that is the scope of what I was going to talk about here. So I'll let you take it over, Victoria.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So actually, Stephen had been, acknowledging the many people and groups that have helped us to put these tools together. And I do want to point out that in terms specifically of the species selector tool, it has taken over 400 farmers, researchers, employees of a wide number of companies and NGOs and government agencies who have helped us with everything from not just the testing of the tool, but actually, doing the initial design and structuring of the tool based usually on existing ones, and then reviewing and updating the data. It's a huge undertaking. And obviously, thus, we also need to thank our funders, and you can see my statement there on the screen. On this screen, I would like to point out that my email address is vackroyd@umd.edu. I also have an ARS email address, and I respond to both. And so, as I said before, my inbox is always open. With that, we're going to actually move to the CCA CEU information and some stuff from Olivia, and then we'll take questions. So Olivia, I believe at this point, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Victoria and Stephen. This is a great tool for anyone working with cover crops, and really appreciate you going through the nuances of it with us. While the CCA information is up on your screen, you'll need to open your CCA app and scan this image in your app for it to work. You can also email me at oliviacayuet@missouri.edu if you have any trouble scanning that QR code, and I can get you signed up for that CCA credit. I'll close out here in a minute, but we have a few minutes where we can take some questions. Anyone who has questions, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A. We have one that came through, and it says, has thought been given to adding an additional parameter for, quote, planting? The first question this individual is often asked on farm is, what equipment do you have? Late July, August is often droughty. If you broadcast a cover crop post-winter wheat, you'll fail. Ideally, the cover crop would be no-till drilled to find the moisture needed for germination. Similarly, if talking about intercropping, equipment is the most important restraint. Do you have any thoughts about how this tool can be used in consideration with on-farm equipment?
That is a great point. So the species selector itself does not really account for planting method. I'm sorry, I'm thinking here as I'm trying to find that link. However, I do want to point out that our seeding rate calculator, which unfortunately is still on a development server, is what I've got bookmarked. But this absolutely does take into account what seeding method you've got as an option. And I'm hoping it's going to let me do it here, because it will alter your seeding rates and whatnot. And it'll tell you if a specific seeding method is not recommended. I don't know what location the speaker, the person asking the question, is in. But for example, in the South, in this specific tool, we have several species that are flat out listed as, just don't do it. Don't broadcast seed faba bean with its huge bean size, for example. In the species selector, it assumes that you're going to drill. And so it provides planting rates for drilling, and I believe also for broadcast and aerial seeding, but it's just a simple static range for each, 100 to 120 bushels per acre. It doesn't alter based on any factors other than just, usually the people who worked with the data in the tool increased the recommended seeding rate for broadcast. And again, for aerial seeding, but it stays a static range, unlike in the seeding rate calculator, which is very dynamic in altering the recommended seeding rates. The speaker seemed to be concerned about something that would actually fall into the comments in the species selector, where if you open the information sheet, you can see comments where we have warnings. And so if you simply shouldn't broadcast wheat, for example, that would be down here if it had been flagged. We do kind of recommend that this tool is more, farmers absolutely can use this tool. We wanted these tools to be as usable by as many people as possible. But in the long run, we did end up with a tool that is probably best where, a farmer and someone who's advising them sit down together to brainstorm. Because you can aim to be as site specific as possible, and you can still miss things like you should not broadcast wheat. And so it's important always to, have someone that you can go back to and double check with for your specific area. I know a lot of farmers know their neighbors, for example. It's always good to know what your neighbors are doing. Hopefully that addressed the question. And if there's a comment that needs to be added to the tool, hit the feedback button and tell us, hey, in Missouri or Nebraska or wherever you are, we don't recommend broadcasting wheat because it simply doesn't work. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't work, for example, in dry land.
Absolutely. Thank you for that explanation. And we also received some questions when individuals were registering. One of the questions we got was about the EQIP program. This individual shared, we're required to plant radishes in the EQIP program. They need to be planted in September, which requires air seeding, which is sloppy and expensive. We never get growth of more than 2 to 3 inches on that, which germinates in the fall. Do you have a suggestion on getting better fall cover crop growth?
Better fall cover crop growth. I would hope that the person who asked the question has gone back to their NRCS point of contact on that one. Honestly, with the radishes, it really depends on where you are in the country. Because a lot of people are worried about planting too early and getting like too much growth, and then the things go to seed and become weeds. I know that radishes are very prone to intraspecific competition. So if your seeding rate is too high, depending on where you are, the radishes will actually compete with each other and they'll stay tiny. Matthew Inguaggio, when he was at Michigan State, did a lot of good research that showed that at that time they were recommending like 20 pounds per acre for radish. And we really think nowadays that like 8 to 12 pounds per acre is the sweet spot. And if you're using precision planting technology, I mean, some people are recommending down to like 2 to 4 pounds per acre. So without knowing more of that person's setup, Olivia, it's hard to really guess what specifically I could recommend for them. My best suggestion would be, going back to their point of contact at NRCS and just telling them, y'all's recommendations I'm struggling with here. Do you have any better ideas? Because their programs absolutely, so I'm in the Northeast, I'm in mid-Atlantic, Maryland, Virginia. And so I'm most familiar with the Maryland cover crop incentive program. And they have absolutely altered their program requirements based on feedback and also based on them trying to help people get more out of their cover crops. And so if the wheel doesn't squeak, then the person that's using the wheel doesn't realize that there's a problem. It never hurts to, comment to your contact. Would be my best
I might just
suggestion.
add a little bit
Please.
to that, Olivia.
Thank you.
So did I hear correctly that it was aerial seeded?
Sounds like it. Air seeded.
That is air seeded.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, look, the reality of it is that any kind of aerial seeding application is very inconsistent. We know that without a question, right? It's, aerial seeding is not relying on just a single rain event. So even if you're, see the rain in the forecast and you do an aerial seeding, and then you hope you get good establishment, it's not the first rain event that launches an aerial seeding and gets it off the ground. It's the second and the third, right? The first just gets it wet. Maybe you get germinated, but survival and growth takes multiple rain events. So we generally see, I mean, I'm not going to give you a factual statement here, but I mean, just observationally, I mean, it's like at best 50% of the time is aerial seeding working. And so if you're relying consistently on aerial seeding to get good performance of a cover crop, it's going to be inconsistent because you don't have that seed to soil contact that is so critical for getting a really good, consistent germination, emergence, and performance from that cover crop. This is not giving you a great answer because I realize for most of our farmers, we're using as much sunlight as we possibly can in a rotation. And so we're maximizing our growing days. And so often most cover crops getting established, regardless of you're in the northern climates or southern climates, they're still sort of coming up against a wall around how much heat units they have in the fall. And so you're trying to get it in how you can. And aerial seeding is one of the ways to try to get in there a little earlier. And it is one of the great problems and reasons why we have inconsistent cover crop performance is because aerial seeding is inconsistent at best.
Thank you, Stephen.
Great takeaways from Victoria being give feedback to NRCS professionals, those making these policies and requirements. And then as Stephen highlighted, knowing the pros and cons of different seeding practices. And as we come to the end of our webinar, I will go ahead and close this out. Victoria shared her contact information. She's available if you have additional questions about the great work her and Stephen are doing with precision sustainable agriculture. And we have those CCA credits available. You can email me if you have any questions or issues accessing that. Thank you for tuning in today. This has been a wonderful discussion. Once again, we really appreciate Victoria and Stephen joining us and the time and effort you've put into these decision tools. If you'd like to learn more about their work, be sure to check out their support tools created by Precision Sustainable Agriculture at precisionsustainableag.org. Also, remember Farmers for Soil Health provides cover crop cost share opportunities, which you can learn more about at farmersforsoilhealth.com. A short Zoom survey will pop up once this webinar concludes. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could provide us feedback. Our contact information is also up on the screen. Please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Erin, or Anne-Marie if you have any questions about Farmers for Soil Health. Keep a lookout for an email in the next week with this webinar recording, which will be on the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture YouTube page, along with some additional resources and a feedback survey in that follow-up email. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you could go to that last slide for us, Victoria.
Yep.
We do like to give thanks to USDA for support of this Climate Smart Commodities project. And with that, we really appreciate you all tuning in and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks.
Thanks.